So, innovating for scale, an evidence-based framework for innovation and scaling. So, Tinkr, we started this this project when it comes to addressing the scaling problem after working with some of the biggest humanitarian organizations in Norway for a while, and just both analyzing and see how we could build innovation maturity into the organizations. And one of the elements that obviously often came up in our discussions were the problem of scale. And when we were asking for the challenges in regards to scale and why it is a problem, there were very often this was a very systemic answer. It has to do with the funding, has to do with the way the humanitarian sector is organized or the ecosystem of the innovations. And although we obviously agree that this is it's a major problem, we said that, well, is it possible to say that, well, disregarding the problems in a systemic level, if we look at it from a project level and see what could we do on a project level to increase the potential of successful scale within these challenges that is on a systemic level, what would we do then? And then we were asking for the hypotheses of why doesn't it work on a project level? And then what we felt that was that there was a lot of hypotheses that weren't really proven and that we thought weren't maybe always correct. For instance, actually quite a few people said that, well, the problem is that the people working in the field aren't interested in using new solutions. And based on our experience, that's not a valid hypothesis. People in field aren't sitting there and getting a new solution and saying, this is a great solution. This would probably solve my problems, but it's new. I don't want to use it. so we said, well, let's go into the hypotheses and try to map the different hypotheses and see if we could address some of them and get some real solutions. Then we contacted the Red Cross that we had worked with for a while and asked them if they were interested in being part of a project where we were going into these hypotheses and see if we could find actual solutions. And then we said that there is a consensus that and the Red Cross said, well, there is a consensus. They said there is a consensus. This is the scaling gap is a core challenge that must be addressed. And they were starting on some specific projects with a scaling potential, and they were most definitely interested in being part of the project. And we have worked together for a while, and we started out trying to map out these hypotheses together. And then we ended up with making yet another model. and the question should be asked, why making yet another model? Because what we found was that there was a vast amount of hypotheses regarding drivers and barriers for scale, also on a project level. I think we mapped out 250 different hypotheses on different levels, from the detailed small changes to the more systemic or structural elements on a project. And we say, well, this is almost important to address in a comprehensive manner. We need a model to structure our work. So that's why we decided to look for models. And we were looking for models, and we found lots of models that were interesting and they were giving us great value. But we still needed to do some adjustments to these models so that it fit the hypothesis that we did found. And what we saw after we had worked with this model for a while was that we need a model that integrates phases and roles. And then I have to say that although I'm now going to present this model, our basic we do agree that all models are wrong. They are not correct representations of the reality in no way. But many are useful, and we have found this model to be fairly useful, and it's going to be very interesting to hear from you what if you see it as useful or potentially useful. So this is our model. So it's a matrix, and on the top we have divided it into 3 different phases. So we have the innovation phase, the transition to scale phase, and the sustainable scale phase. And within each of these phases, we have different stages. So we have 9 stages altogether. I'm going to go into the different stages afterwards, and just showing now that, and on the left hand, we have the roles. We had lots of discussion about how to divide the different roles, and obviously this is also a model, right? So if it's 4 or 6 or what's inside the different the roles, well, it depends on the organization. But we find that it's important to have the innovators, obviously, because they are the ones who's actually innovating, making the solutions. Then we have the scalers, and the scalers are the ones that are in charge of securing the scalability of your innovation and securing the scaling of your innovation when you're going to the transition to scale and the sustainable scale phase. Then you have the adopters, and they are both the ones that are making the decision makers, the ones deciding to use the innovation, and also the implementers, the ones who are implementing the solution. This can be in some projects, this could be many different, right? It could be on a national level, and then going down, they could be the government, for instance, could be a decision maker, and then it could run down all the way to the to regional offices, and then maybe to the specific schools, and then you end up with the end users that are the teachers or the students, for instance, when it comes to education. So this is one way of sorting out the roles. The most important part is the integration of the stages and the roles. So let's talk a little bit about the innovation part first. There is a big difference between innovating for scaling, and innovation. So although most of the models out there say that it's important to integrate scaling in the innovation phase, most of the tools are based on that you have a solution, a pilot, and they say, let's test the validity of, or the scaling potential of your solution. That is scaling and innovation. Innovating for scale is including scalability into the innovation process. And we find that this is very, very important. So when we have the innovation process, we have divided it into 4. This is based on most creativity and innovation research, or creativity and innovation models that are also different number of stages and different names for the different stages. But in general, it's based on basically the same framework. So first, it's the insight phase. This is where you choose your problem, which problem to address, and to understand your problem, and understand also the potential impact, right? You're addressing, you're doing insight activities. Then you go into the ideation phase. You are finding potential solutions to your problem, choosing which potential solutions to address, going into the development and testing phase. Here you are developing the potential solutions, testing if there are actual solutions. So you're going from potential to actual solutions. And then you enter the validation phase, which is the beginning of most scaling elements. This is where you are testing if your solution does actually have impact. So does it solve your problem in the best way, in a way that gives actual value? And then we add so then you have the innovation phase, and then we add the roles. And then we have to see, okay, does the roles, the specific roles, what do they need to do in the specific phases? So this is where the matrix and the actual value of the model appears. And I would like to use 2 examples. So I'm going to use first the greenhouse effect, and then I'm going to use the second chance education as an example of how we can use this model. I don't know if you know the term the greenhouse effect, but it's about when you're doing an innovation. So when you're working on an innovation, you're within the innovation greenhouse, right? So you get extra funding, you might have more time that you usually have. You have top leader management are not only are they following you, but they might even supporting you. You have an organizational climate that are supporting you because it's your innovation. You have a great motivation, and you are basing it on the structures and elements that you know, the competence that are available in your organization. All these parts are going together inside the innovation greenhouse to make it easier for you to invent something or to innovate a new solution. The problem when we talk about innovating for scale is that the surroundings are obscure, right? So these are the real world out there. This is where you are supposed to scale your solution, but it's not part of your innovation. So there's a very different context. So, and then when you have your solution, you are saying that, well, let's take this solution out of my innovation greenhouse and into the real world. And as with plants, very often, at least for me, I'm living in the Arctic. If I take my plants out of the greenhouse and put them into the real world, they are snowing down. They won't succeed. They are dying, not even slowly, very fast. And this is the problem with many innovations. You aren't aware of the fact that you are within the innovation greenhouse, and you think that you're out in the real world. And then when you're taking it out in the real world, it doesn't necessarily succeed. So how can we solve this? Well, and this is one way of using the model. This is just one example of a specific scaling problem that you could address using the models. First, you would say, well, what's the goal of the scalers? Well, the scalers would, in the insight phase, they would say that, well, we need to address the scaling context. They are making sure that we are throwing light on the obscure parts outside of the greenhouse, right? So to say, which context does have the same problem as we are addressing? And which context does seem this problem as so important that they might be interested in solving the problem? What are the contextual differences? What does these different contexts have that are different from our context and difference between each others? And then also looking at what are the models for sustainable scale. Some call it business models. I don't like it that much when we talk about the humanitarian sector. Business models is one of the models that is a model for sustainable scale. There's also other models, and they are addressing this. And they're also making sure that the adapters and the end users are part of the process, so that adapters would be part of the ideation process, so that you get the contextual knowledge into not only defining the problem, but also defining what potential solutions could we have. The scalers are using the insight from the insight phase to make criteria for selection of which ideas to go forward with. And then when you enter the development phase, you would say that the scalers would say, remember, there is one thing that is particularly important in a scaling project. It is the difference between I lost my word. Between flexibility and standardization, right? Which is not important when you are innovating, but if you are scaling, to be clear on where do I standardize and where do I have flexibility is of immense importance in the development phase. So the scalers are making sure that you are integrating this into the development phase. And this is just an example. So this way you could say that, well, we have this greenhouse effect problem. How could we address it? We could use this framework to make sure that we are choosing the different roles into the different stages of the process, and then you get some kind of solutions. And we could organize the hypothesis. The other example is second chance education. So we did a very short review of the scaling of the second chance education, and our findings were they are truly innovating for scale in every step of the process. They're defining relevant contextual differences and including them into the process. They're understanding the needs and possibilities of the different contexts, and they are including implementing part in all the phases. So, and this was based on our very short review. This was our kind of main findings, and it gives the problem a solid base. And then we use it, we put it into the model, or we use the model to find the solutions, vice versa, depends. So what did we see? Well, first of all, they integrated actively the end users into the insight phase. They had a 9 months period of insight where they went out into specific contexts, getting exactly the contextual differences, understanding the context, understanding the problem. And by that, having scaling as an integrated part of the insight phase. They involved the implementing parties in all the steps of the process. In the insight, in the ideation, when they were developing and testing the solutions, the implementing parties were part of the process in different contexts. So they have, I don't remember, 5 or 6 different contexts that they were trying out the solutions. And by that, they found very different problems. And they found that actually the different contexts had different kind of problems that they needed to solve, right? And then they had strong partnerships with the national and the local governments in the development and validation phase that will increase the potential of actually getting them on board because they have solutions that fits their context, right? So as a final note on this innovation part, so this was what we found. This was how we use the model when addressing or analyzing the scalability or the scaling work in second chance education. I just have to say that these activities, this is important, these activities inevitably leads to increased use of resources, increased time, and increasing the complexity. So but it is necessarily so that if you are innovating for scale, you have to include other elements that you would in an ordinary innovation process, and that does increase the use of resources, increasing time, and the increased complexity. If not, you are not really innovating for scale. So then, moving on to the scaling part. So in the scaling phase, so then which includes both the two scaling phases of the model. We were mapping out the different stages of the transition to scale phase, making it more specific. We included the models of sustainable scale, and then reinvention is an important part of the scaling process and is also included in the model. So then it's the standardization versus flexibility. So very quickly, I would go through these phases, and then just very quickly then say a little bit about the model finally, since we don't have that much time. So in the transition to scale, this is based on Everett Rogers' diffusion of innovation, and he has these phases. But we also included the AIDA model, which is a marketing model, which is used by marketing agencies, for instance, and then we decide that we define the transition to scale phase into 3 stages. First is the knowledge. So and then we were talking about the innovation context and the scaling context. So the scaling context is where you want your innovation to be used. So first of all, they need to know that your innovation exists. So they need to have knowledge of the existence of your innovation. And then they start building knowledge. So this is a phase where they're building knowledge about your solution before they go into the persuasion phase. And in the persuasion phase, it is more emotional. This is where you start to see if, and in the AIDA model, you would have an interest and desire. So first, you would need you would need to make an interest, or make the scaling context interested in your innovation. It means that they need to see that it solves a problem that is important for them, a problem that they would like to prioritize in a different way than the problem is solved today, that it solves it better or is more efficient than the way it has today. And that makes them interested in learning more. So these knowledge and persuasion phases, they go back and forth, right? So then they get an interest and they want to learn more. That's when you start to get them information about how you're actually creating value. And what is your solution? How is it different from other existing solutions in the market? And then they go from the interest to the desire. So you are getting slowly or fast, depending on the innovation, you're going into the desire when they start saying, well, this is actually a solution that I would like to use, right? So you had then shown that it is an important problem for them. It solves the problem in a way that gives impact, and that they think that this is viable for my cultural, for my organization, for the way we are viewing our strategy. And then finally, they make a decision. It's important and when they make the decision to use your solution. So it's important then to remember, and it says more about that in the report, that although you have made the decision to use your solution, doesn't necessarily mean that you end up actually using it. It can be many different reasons why someone makes a decision and it doesn't end up implemented it anyway. They don't have the mandate, so they make the decision, but they need some kind of top level management to agree. They don't have the resources. It takes too much time. They don't get buy-in from other people in the organization. Many different reasons why a decision doesn't necessarily mean that you are implementing the solution. But then you move over to the implementation phase, and that's when you start using using the innovation. This is where you start to experience all the problems with the innovation. This far, you have been in charge of communicating the potential benefits and how it works. Now they're experiencing things by themselves. And very often an implementation phase stops, right? So you're starting an implementation phase, and then you might use it for a couple of months, and then you see that it kind of fades off. You don't continue using it, right? And this is where you end up in the confirmation stage. So your implementation, you are getting it into the organization, and then you need the confirmation that they say that, well, the information that I got from the ones that are the innovators or the innovating organization is actually real. It does actually create value for me. It is actually important for me, and I would like to continue using this. And the goal here, and the confirmation stage could be very long. It could be years, but it could also be only weeks, depending on the innovation, right? And the important part is that this is a process. It's ongoing. And this is where reinvention enters. Because for many innovators, they see reinvention or changing your innovation as something bad, something that they want. They don't want it to be changed because I have the final solution. The problem is that when you go to different contexts, very often you need to change your innovation. You need to have the flexibility to do changes and to reinvent. And very often it's important for the scaling context to do this because they actually overemphasize. They say that, well, this is completely new because it's right. It's basically the same innovation, but they say that it's completely new because now it fits our context because our context is so different from all the other contexts. But I could use these small parts of your innovation and then suddenly it works. And it's very important for the scalers to be aware of this, that reinvention is a very, very important part of the confirmation phase. And, this is when we start to talk about sustainable scale, right? And I said earlier that I don't like that we say that models for sustainable scale equals business models, because business model is used by businesses, and we feel that then we start to talk about the market and it's different payment regimes. Sustainable scale models could be many other kinds of models, and I think it's important that we call them that, models for sustainable scale. So this is a very brief outline of the scaling part of the model. So to sum up, some of the values of the model that we have seen. So first of all, it provides a framework for structuring and understanding the problem of scale, and also for then planning for scale and planning to do the right activities in the different stages and having the roles at the right place in your scaling process. It integrates the stages and the roles so that we get a matrix and we can go into specific areas. So you can say what is the role of the scaler in the knowledge phase, right? And you could start to map out and you get a fairly clear structure. It's an explicit focus on the stages of diffusion, which I find that many people are unaware of. They feel that scaling is an activity, not a set of many different specific activities. And it's usually although they're iterative, they are following a clear line. There's an explicit focus on the role of scaler and the adapter in the whole process. They are included in the whole process from the beginning, from the insight phase. And it is a framework for developing recommendations and tools. And this is just a start, right? So this is an example of a tool that we have made for the insight phase. This is a project definition canvas where we include scaling as a part of the insight phase, right? So this is when you start mapping out your project in the early start of your project, in the insight phase. What kind of elements are you focusing on? Well, scaling context, contextual challenges, stakeholders, making sure that they address that in the beginning of the process so you get real innovating for scale is one example of a tool that could be relevant in a project where we are focusing on getting more value from the scaling activities. And to sum up, I say that we are working a lot with innovation, and innovation are complex endeavors. We are using lots of resources, and it's obvious for us that to really, and sometimes very often to be able to argue that it's important to do the innovation project, scaling needs to be part of the project, or else your return on investment aren't great enough. That's why scaling is a most important part of most innovation projects. And this is one way that we might be able to solve a little bit or understand a little bit more about the problem of scale. Thank you.